Good evening, everyone. I'm Louise Mirror, President and CEO of the New York Historical Society, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this very first episode of the History Hour, a live virtual program presented each Thursday evening exclusively for members and other supporters of the New York Historical Society. I hope you're all safe and healthy as you watch this at home. And we look forward to seeing you back at New York Historical just as soon as it is safe to reopen our doors. Now, just before I introduce our scholars, I want to take a moment to thank all of our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other donors for your great generosity. We can only continue to make history matter with your ongoing support. Now, I know there are many important causes vying for your philanthropy these days. That makes us doubly grateful that you have chosen to be a part of our family. And now to our speakers. Valerie Paley, who will be moderating tonight's conversation, is Senior Vice President and Chief Historian at New York Historical. She's also Director of our Center for Women's History. Harold Holzer is the author, co-author, or editor of more than 50 books on Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War era, including The Civil War in 50 Objects, which was also an exhibition at New York Historical back in 2013. We are so very grateful to Harold for lending us his time this evening. Tonight's program will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers, which you can submit using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. In the interest of simplicity, we've disabled the chat function this evening, so please make sure to use the Q&A. Valerie will get to as many questions as time allows. Tonight's program will be recorded so that we may present an encore performance in future times. And now I turn it over to Valerie and Harold. Please enjoy, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next Thursday evening.
Thank you so much, Louise, and good evening, everyone. It is my absolute delight and pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with my good friend and professional colleague, Harold Holzer. As Louise said, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom, or in my case, top of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can toward the end. So now, let's turn our attention to some objects that help us describe the Civil War. And might we see the cover of our book, Civil War in 50 Objects. Now, in the museum realm, particularly the History Museum, the art, objects, and documents on display have the power to stand in for a larger historical narrative, conveying so much more than what is structurally defining of that object itself. But Harold, what about our book, Civil War in 50 Objects? How did this come about, and how effective is it at conveying the narrative sweep of the Civil War in 50 objects?
Well, it's a kind of a tactile history that brings you closer to the lived experience of the Civil War. That's because that's what made it so exciting for me. And if you're asking how it happened because of Louise Mirror. So Louise asked me if I would be interested in doing this kind of a chronicle for publication. And she said, why don't you come in? I think you were there that first day of review. Why don't you come in and I'll put some of the objects I have in mind on a few tables in the administrative offices of the Historical Society. And what I saw that during that first visit literally took my breath away, because I mean, we will be discussing these objects over the next 4 weeks, or at least, 10 of the 50. But one of them was a relic of Abraham Lincoln's presidency in his own hand that I never knew about. And I had been 40 years in the field. That's just a way of paying tribute to the kind of boundless trove that the New York Historical Society boasts. So it was a thrill to see it, and I wanted to, and I know you did. We wanted to share the thrill of the actual object from wartime with our readers and with members and attendees at the Historical Society.
Absolutely. And it was hard to whittle them down to 50, as a matter of fact. And there
Yeah,
were
it
just
was.
so many things to choose from. It was wonderful.
We could
Um,
have done 100, but the mandate was 50, and it was an editing process for sure.
It was, and I enjoyed editing you very much. You're an amazing writer, but also wonderful to edit. So, and that's how I first got to know you, and it was just a thrill.
Exactly.
So this is nice to revisit this wonderful project. So tonight we'll be looking at two objects in particular. Maybe we could see the images. Yes, a cast of Lincoln's hand and a spear-like pike. Now, can we see the pike by itself, please? So this first object looks like a spear from the Middle Ages. What is it, Harold?
It's a spear, all right, but it's not a spear from the Middle Ages. It is a weapon that the famous abolitionist John Brown ordered from a blacksmith in Connecticut to supply the planned raid he had in mind against the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, what is now West Virginia. Why did he order this kind of a weapon? Because and it's kind of ironic in a way, as much as John Brown believed that slavery was evil, that people of color had a right to live in liberty and pursuit of happiness, he didn't harbor illusions about African Americans of the day and their abilities to use modern weapons, which were non-existent, because even where African Americans were free, they were generally forbidden from using arms for fear by whites that they would, mount an insurrection. So as John Brown planned this incredibly daring raid into Western Virginia, he ordered dozens of these pikes, because his idea was not only to raid the arsenal, but to arouse enslaved African Americans in Western Virginia at the news of his incursion to rise up against their owners and start a slave insurrection. So these were the weapons that he thought African people would be using, in the most primitive manner to secure their own freedom. And they're simply, 6'6" wooden pikes, by the way, about the height of Abraham Lincoln. And on the end was a Bowie knife. And it was the simplest, most ancient weapon one could think of. And I don't want to get ahead of the story, but the story is whether they were used, obviously, as we go through the story.
Right. If we can have the image of John Brown, just so we have a sense of who this person was. This is a famous painting in the New York Historical Collection. It's huge. It's like maybe 10 feet high, called John Brown's Blessing. Let's talk a bit about him. Who was he? Abraham Lincoln himself said John Brown's effort was peculiar. How so?
And by the way, he said that in New York City. And he said it 2 months after John Brown was executed. And I'll talk a little bit about Brown, and then I'll explain a bit about why he said what he said. So John Brown was a former leather tanner, like Ulysses Grant, cattle rancher, who had an epiphany in 1837 when a mob in Alton, Illinois, destroyed the printing press of a journalist named Elijah Lovejoy, and then killed him in the warehouse where he had hidden his printing press. He was an abolitionist editor. That event had an interesting impact on the two people we're going to be speaking about tonight. For Abraham Lincoln, it inspired his very first major public address at his home in Springfield, Illinois, where he said that this act of violence should inspire reverence for the laws. Now, as John Brown interpreted it, he believed it should inspire reverence for insurrection. He became an abolitionist overnight, and he believed in armed resistance to the struggle. And he devoted the next 22 years of his life to ending slavery with violence if necessary. In the 1850s, he and his sons led a band of anti-slavery guerrillas into Kansas, a disputed state which was either going to enter the Union as a slave or free state, to frighten pro-slavery residents and those who were coming in to add to the pro-slavery voting bloc. And, conducted battles, burned people's towns, and meanwhile the pro-slavery people were burning abolitionist towns and destroying newspapers and courthouses. He killed so many people in Kansas that it sort of became Bloody Kansas on his watch and his initiative. And he became known as Osawatomie Brown, named after one of the battles that his armed men fought. And then he retreated back to New York, where he was funded by a lot of donors to mount this next insurrection into Virginia. So while Abraham Lincoln is debating for the Senate, and he is part of the political system for sure, and he believes in gradualism to destroy slavery, Brown is still at his armed insurrection crusade. And many famous people donate to the fundraising for this
Frederick
cause.
Douglass and others?
Yeah, we don't know for sure about Douglass. We know that he was frightened enough when the raid came off that he fled to Europe to get away from prosecution. But William Lloyd Garrison donated $25. Future governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew, donated money. And he marched to Maryland with his sons and a band of 18 people with the spears. And in October 1859, a surprise attack against the old arsenal in Harpers Ferry, which is still there, still stands, overpowered the guard, took over the arsenal, and from there everything went wrong. Plantation owners surrounded him on the hills around the arsenal, which sits on the confluence of several rivers. It's pretty vulnerable, and it's a crazy place to build an arsenal. But there were 100,000 weapons there, and it was an inviting target. And eventually, as history tells us, he was taken prisoner.
And there was a fascinating cast of characters when I was reading this essay again that participated in the raid on Harpers Ferry. Even Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, they show up in the story. How did the event unfold with them, and ultimately what happened to Brown?
So it was considered an act of treason by the governor of Virginia, even though it was federal property. So he immediately called out the Marines, and the commander of the Marine regiment that marched on Harpers Ferry to get John Brown out of there and arrest or kill him was Colonel Robert E. Lee. Not the Lee we know about who had the luxuriant beard that John Brown had, but a very handsome, supposed to be the handsomest officer in the Army with a luxuriant black mustache. And he, at one point, dispatched one of his officers to walk up to the arsenal and demand that John Brown surrender or be taken, dead or alive. And the person he dispatched to do that was Jeb Stuart, who would be one of his generals in the Confederate Army in just 2 or 3 years from that point. Brown refused to surrender. The Marines stormed the arsenal. Another of Brown's sons was killed in the raid. Brown was nearly killed. He was struck with a sword, but he lived. And he was put on trial very quickly. By December, he had been convicted and he was hanged in Charlestown, Virginia, just a few miles away from Harpers Ferry. The painting that we looked at a minute ago by Noble, who grew up on a plantation, by the way, and was radicalized against slavery himself, shows a moment in legend that has some truth in it, and that is that Brown, as he was marched down the courthouse steps toward the gallows with a jeering mob and some sympathetic African Americans outside, saw a woman with a baby, and the woman held her child up for a blessing, and Brown put his hand on the baby's head as if to bless the child. And this moment of kind of nobility and courage became instantaneously a legend and was quickly immortalized by this former slave-owning painter who had also become very, very anti-slavery. By the way, talk about the continuing coincidences. Abraham Lincoln was in Kansas, the site of John Brown's original raids, when the news came that he was executed. And Lincoln gave a speech in Leavenworth at which he said, John Brown is executed. He committed treason and there was no other recourse. But let this be a lesson to any Southern state that contemplates treason against the Union in the future. They will be dealt with exactly the same way. Yeah. And then when he comes to New York, just a few months later in February, to give the Cooper Union address that would be his Harpers Ferry, it would thrust him into national fame. He says, what you said earlier, that it was John Brown's case was a peculiar one. And what he wanted to convey by that, by peculiar, he means unique, not strange. He wants people to understand that anti-slavery men are not all violent. They're not all willing to start an armed rebellion. He wants people to know that there is a way of putting slavery, as he puts it that night, on the course of ultimate extinction without violence. As we know, that was not what the future held, but he wanted to separate with the Republican Party from John Brown, for sure.
Let's just see the Pike one last time again, and before we move on to our object. So just looking at this Pike again, just explain how these weapons exactly were used with this little knife at the end of a stick, and how the handful of African Americans who joined the raid, they weren't really instructed in how to use them. You want to explain what?
Yeah, I mean, so
how does this exactly?
I mean, I am assuming that you hold it javelin style and throw it, or you use it underhand to thrust against your enemies. The fact is, as you point out, they were never used, and irony piles upon irony. When the African Americans who were part of the John Brown raiding party saw these weapons, they had no clue. They had never been to the movies. They had never seen racist interpretations of Native peoples using spears, so they hadn't a clue. By that time, Brown had trained them in the use of rifles. The idea that African Americans were not capable of using modern weaponry would be dispelled within 4 years when African Americans joined the Union Army and fought for their own freedom with absolutely modern weapons. But they had no clue, and neither do I when you come right down to it. It's pretty daunting to me.
It is a fascinating object, and it's a thrill to see it.
By the way,
at the New York Historical Society.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there were 1,000 of these made for this slave insurrection that never occurred. And the New York Historical Society owns, and they're all numbered. So we have number 101, which is pretty good in the limited edition. Yeah.
Well, you conclude your essay in the book saying John Brown had tried to launch a modern revolution with spears.
Yeah, with a medieval weapon.
But
yeah.
Let's move on to our next object this evening. This is a cast, or actually a cast by Augustus St. Gaudens from the original by Leonard Volk. Here is the gargantuan hand of the rail splitter, champion wrestler, and prairie debater who avoided using his hands to gesture while speaking because it looked like he was swatting bees,
Right.
you say. He also, of course, if you want to romanticize that hand, it signed the Emancipation Proclamation and clutched the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural. So tell us a bit about how these casts were made, Harold.
Well, it starts with this sculptor, not too well known today, Leonard Wells Volk, who was interestingly a cousin by marriage of Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's lifelong rival in politics. Well, Volk was a nonpartisan artist, and after seeing Abraham Lincoln conduct a trial in Chicago in 1860, he asked him to pose for him. He'd actually seen him in the Lincoln-Douglas debates also when he was a Douglas rooter. And Lincoln came to his studio on Dearborn Street in Chicago in March of 1860 to have a life mask made, which was a tool that sculptors of the period used if they weren't going to enjoy repeated sittings. And Lincoln was a busy trial lawyer at the time on a case. So he submitted to this very, difficult life mask process, wet plaster hardening on his face for 30 minutes while he had straws in his nose breathing. And then when it came time to take it off, Volk couldn't get it off. And Lincoln took those massive hands and tugged. And Volk remembered that it brought tears to Lincoln's eyes because they pulled the hairs out of the temples. And he did not remember it with amusement. But he did come back and then pose for the bust a bit. He would come from court. He would take off his jacket. He would take off his shirt, and Volk asked him to pull down his union suit. I guess he was wearing long underwear. So he took off his long underwear top and tied it in front of him, and he was pretty embarrassed about it because when the sitting was over, he dressed very quickly and hurried down the stairs. And someone stopped him on the street and said, "Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, tall sir, but your sleeves of your underwear seem to be dragging behind you." So he had to go back up to the sky. Anyway, Volk told this story. Well, he was going to he completed this bust just neck up. I have a little copy of it. I hope people can see it. It's over my shoulder. That little white plaster was the copied of that original bust. Lincoln liked it. He said, "There is the animal himself," he said when he saw it. Then a couple of months later, Lincoln was nominated for president. Well, Volk realized he had something going here. He didn't just have to do a small bust to put in a store window in Chicago with his other work. So he got on a train the day that Lincoln was nominated in Chicago. Lincoln was not there. He was home, tradition of the day. And he got to Lincoln's hometown of Springfield the day after the nomination. And he said, "Now I'd like to cast your hands as well, because you are a national figure now, and I want to make a full-length statue of you, as I have done of my cousin Stephen Douglas, who you just defeated, and he financed my art education in Rome, but you're the man. So I'm not going to..." Right, the heck with Stephen Douglas. So Lincoln...
Could we just, let's just look at a picture of Lincoln. Can we just throw that up on the screen? This is a photograph of the animal himself.
Right,
and
and by the way, it's whatever the caption says, it's 1864, it's not 1865.
Right, well, that's from our collection, from our print.
Some early curator wrote that in, yeah.
That's right, in pen. That's not what we do now.
Right.
But you say in your essay that Lincoln realized that in order to be taken seriously as a statesman, he needed to subject himself to make himself more readily available to painters and sculptors, artists. Why is that?
He had been photographed from time to time. Obviously, when that picture was taken, he was already one of the most photographed men in the country. But what a great choice, because it shows those hands as they looked when he was in repose. Photographs were fine. They were becoming popular because they could be reproduced by 1860 and 61 and be circulated to increase a person's recognition quotient. But paintings and statues were for famous people. Lincoln had been a congressman. He had gone to Washington. He had seen the statue of George Washington outside of the Capitol, even though it was something of a national joke and was later relegated to the Smithsonian. He had seen the statue of Jefferson outside the White House at receptions. That's also gone. But that's what famous men inspired. So Volk was the first, but there were other sculptors who followed, and artists always available for sittings, even though he never sat still the way George Washington did for Gilbert Stuart. He opened his mail or chatted, but he made himself almost constantly available, never said no. I've only found a few examples over the next 5 years. And by the way, when Volk arrived on May 19th, 1860 to do the hands, Lincoln was not in the best condition to have that kind of a thing done.
Let's just see that hand again. Can we see that image again, please? There we go.
So the night before, he had hosted a reception at his home after winning the nomination. and he had shaken thousands of hands to the point where his hand had swelled up. And you can see there are no veins on the back of the hand because the hand was puffy. Volk said to Lincoln, this casting was done at his home in Springfield. And Volk said to Mr. Lincoln, do you have an object that you can hold? So Lincoln excused himself, and the next thing Volk remembered is he heard sawing coming from the direction of Lincoln's privy and shed. And when Lincoln came back, he was holding the end of a stick, and he explained that he had cut the handle off a broom, and now he was whittling it. And Volk said, Mr. Lincoln, you don't have to do that because you're not going to use the stick in the final sculpture. And Lincoln said, oh, I wanted to have it nice. So he continued to whittle it. And that's the cast of the right hand that had shaken so many hands it had swollen. By the way, apparently that was something that happened to Lincoln, because we know that just 3 years later, his hand was so swollen from handshaking at a New Year's reception at the White House that he felt he could not sign the Emancipation Proclamation until he rested and stretched. People who were witnesses, there were about 4 witnesses. When he put the pen down, people thought he was going to renege on signing the proclamation. And he finally explained, my hand, I've shaken so many hands for New Year's at our party that I have no feeling in my hand. And if people look in 100 years at my signature and see that it's quivering, they will think I hesitated. And so he waited. So that was a consequence, the way Richard Nixon grew a mustache during a debate and appeared, Abraham Lincoln's hand swelled up.
Amazing. We have a couple more minutes just between ourselves before we open it up to Q&A, and I just wanted to ask you one more thing. If we could see the slide of the seated Lincoln image. This is, of course, Daniel Chester French. We have the maquette of the head, the life-size maquette for the Lincoln Memorial, but this is a very famous sculpture of Lincoln. And I'd like you to tell our audience a bit about the reach of these casts that Volk did, and how subsequent generations of sculptors owe a great debt of gratitude to Volk for what he did.
So obviously, in the absence of the living model after 1865, sculptors relied on Volk. Volk went on to create his statue. There's one in Rochester and one in Springfield, not enormously successful as public works of art, but he did reproduce busts, draped busts, non-draped busts, the hands themselves, the life mask itself, and he did very well manufacturing these reproductions, so that sculptors eventually bought copies of their own. Augustus St. Gaudens used the mask and the hands for his great standing Lincoln in Chicago, and Daniel Chester French, of course, used the mask and the hands, which are preserved at Chesterwood in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, to model the great Lincoln Memorial sculpture. And no, they don't say AL in sign language, which is one of the myths about those hands in the Lincoln Memorial.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I get that. I wrote a book about French, so I get a lot of questions about that. And he had done a statue of Gallaudet, so there was a suspicion that it was his tribute to the deaf students and teachers he had come to know during that commission. Anyway, I digress. Later, the hands and masks become great collectibles, and St. Gaudens' own copy, a bronze, is the one that the New York Historical Society owns. By the way, in an accident of geography, the left hand from the St. Gaudens set is across the park at my old alma mater, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But I guess people can run from one side of the park to see the complete set. You know, it's interesting. How did it come to be? How did Augustus St. Gaudens get his copy? Well, the editor of the Century magazine owned the original copy at one point, and he had bronze replicas made. And here's the most fitting irony for the day. His name was Richard Watson Gilder. And of
Other
course,
Richard Gilder.
the New York Historical Society and the city and Central Park and all of his other objects, all of the other objects of his life of generosity just lost our Richard Gilder, and
Yes.
sort of brings the story full cycle.
Absolutely, indeed. Well, we are about ready to open it up for questions, and I see that our first one is this, Harold. Why were George Washington and Thomas Jefferson statues considered jokes and removed?
Hey, um, I only said that the Washington was a joke. I'm not even sure
Because it
why
kind of is.
it is.
It's
So
like
the
crazy.
Jefferson was removed because they remodeled the fountain area in front of the White House where it had stood. The Washington was a Horatio Greenough, I think, was the sculptor, and it showed Washington in a toga, bare-chested. Although it was visible,
It's huge. It's gigantic.
And it's visible in the early photographs of presidential inaugurations. Lincoln looked at the back of it when he was inaugurated in 1861 and 1865. But people just thought it was a riot to see George Washington without a shirt, and they nicknamed it Georgie in his bath. So, or Georgie Porgy. I mean, it was in fact, it was not Washington, but the work. And eventually it was taken away at one of the early Capitol Plaza renovations. And it sits today, I think, in the National Museum of American History, where it's, at eye level and you can't really tell much from it. It's sort of banished to a corner. And but there it was. It was once one of the most prominent public sculptures in the country.
Let's see. We have another question. Where is the Stephen Douglas statue now?
The Stephen Douglas statue, which is, teeny like Stephen Douglas, is on the top of the stairway at the old state capitol in Springfield, Illinois. It was purchased for the state, and it sits just outside, ironically, of the room where Abraham Lincoln delivered his House Divided address in 1858, warning against divisiveness in the country over the slavery issue.
Stephen Douglas was a full foot or more shorter than Lincoln, was he not?
Yeah, he was about 5'4", and Lincoln was 6'4". They must have made quite a contrast on the debate stage in 1850.
They must have. Next question: is there any memorial to John Brown, and if so, when did it become acceptable to have a memorial to him? And if not, why not?
John Brown's reputation has gone, up and down over the years. Most people condemned him. The African American community never did, incidentally. And for generations, he was dismissed as a madman. You can go up to the 1940s. I think the movie was called Santa Fe Trail, which showed the raid on Harpers Ferry and showed, I hope I'm not wrong about the movie. My daughter, who is a film historian, will be very angry at me, but he was portrayed, interestingly, by Raymond Massey, who also portrayed Abraham Lincoln in a famous film, and definitely portrayed as a demonic madman. I would say that the most famous memorial tribute to John Brown, and I'm going to get the dates wrong, so I won't venture them, is a mural in the Topeka State House, which shows Brown as sort of an angel of God with his hands upraised and fire, war breaking out in back of him. It makes him sort of an apostle of violence that leads to freedom. And it's appropriate that it's in Topeka in a way, because it's this town where the Brown v. Board of Education case was hatched.
It's also very poignant to see his grave, and his I guess his sons are with him in Lake Placid. Just a very simple but beautiful memorial in and of itself, I think. Here's another question about John Brown. Why didn't he use the muskets that were in the armory rather than the spears?
He did. I mean, he just didn't think his African American followers would be able to use the muskets once they were liberated or liberated themselves, which is the unlikely scenario he created from their plantations nearby. He used there was rifle fire at the armory. He broke out a few windows and fired back at Lee's Marine contingent, and there was a lot of exchange of gunfire when the Marines led the charge and broke down the thick rounded door to the armory. So they used the rifles for sure.
Yeah. Here's another question also. I mean, a lot of interest in John Brown this evening, which is great.
Yeah, let's
and
hear
you
from
see
the
how something is odd looking. I know we're trying to keep Lincoln away from you. You're the Lincoln man, but it is interesting how a spear that looks so peculiar like that can generate this kind of a discussion about the topic of John Brown and what he stood for. And here's a question: was his anti-slavery passion a function of his religiosity? And were his sons as dedicated to the anti-slavery causes as John Brown was?
And so the answers are yes and yes. It was definitely bound up in religiosity and in his interpretation of God's will and God's hatred of slavery. So it was a messianic approach. Val, when you say that the overwhelming number of questions are about the Pike, I don't know if you remember how worried we were about putting that object at the beginning of the book, because it doesn't really photograph all that well. It is what it is. And also we thought, how do you convey the size of it? Because it's 6 foot 9 inches.
Like
yeah. And you came up with the idea of running it diagonally across 2 pages, which at least added some heft to it. And that was a good decision. But again, I'm glad people get it, because it's not a picturesque object, sure.
No, not at all. Okay, so here's one about the elk casts. How many were created from the original, and where were they distributed during Lincoln's life?
So again, there are casts of the hands, there are casts of the face, there are busts. There is no good count of how many of these were created. And it's also extremely hard to, it takes expert eyes that are more expert than mine to tell what generation of mask they were. The mass reproduction generally started in the 1880s. And, Caproni and Company, a New York firm, was one of the early manufacturers of them. And you can see their little brass nameplate in the plaster of some of them. The bronzes were much more exclusive and much more expensive. But it's like counting Currier and Ives prints. There are no record. Mm-hmm. And they're valuable and they're desirable in private and public collections. But they were, I don't want to say common, but they were ubiquitous.
Yeah. Well, they're still, you can still buy them in our store at New York Historical, and I think at the Met as well, right?
Yes. And Lincoln had a second life mask taken a couple of months before his death, a much easier to bear process, but it never achieved the popularity of the first one. And the first mask and hands inspired poetry and, again, the patronage of other artists who recognize it as the best model.
Mm-hmm. And there's a certain immediacy too to the hands, to seeing them, and make a really nice paperweight. Here's actually a question I think we're going to get every week, and maybe the answer will be different every week. What item of the 50 objects is your favorite and the most significant? Which might not be one and the same, but which is your favorite?
My favorite is probably one that we will get to at the end of the program, at the end of the series. So I shouldn't say too much about it, but it is very much like a 19th century version of Tim Russert's famous oak tag tabulation of electoral votes. For those of you who remember the disputed election of 2000, the late Tim Russert wrote down the votes. Here's how Florida will do this, and here's how West Virginia will do that, and here is how Bush could get to 270. Here's how Gore could get to 270. That oak tag is in the Smithsonian. Well, the New York Historical Society has a mini version of the oak tag, Abraham Lincoln, calculating how on earth, as unpopular as he is in 1864, he's going to get to the required number of electoral votes to be reelected. That's my favorite.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary little document, right? Yeah.
Did you ask about the most significant too?
Yes.
So we will get to this one too, but let's say it is it's an original relic of the draft riots in New York of 1863, which almost consumed the city, but certainly sent it into paroxysms of fear and much destruction and death as well. And we have a living relic of that episode in American history.
Yeah, and you describe it so beautifully in the book. I have to say, it's one of my favorite chapters of the book.
Thank you.
But we won't give it away, will we? We'll have to come back and hear it next time.
I'll get a chance to change my mind, as you say.
Yes, I think you might. Yeah. So one more question. I think we have time for one or two more. Which was Lincoln's favorite bust or portrait of him, and was it the one that you discussed?
Well, he told a sculptor in 1864 that he had created his favorite mud head. That was his description of another bust. But if that's so, I don't really think his taste was that terrific, because it's not as good as the Volk or St. Gordon's. St. Gordon's is later, of course. He was very practical. He liked the next work that was being done. He liked a photograph from his pre-presidency in 1857, but his wife didn't like it, he admitted, because of the disordered condition of his hair. So as for Lincoln, I think we'll rely on what he said to a printmaker who sent him a copy of an engraved portrait. Lincoln wrote back and said, "It seems to me an excellent likeness, but truth to say, I am a very indifferent judge."
Fair enough. I mean, it looks pretty good in the Matthew Brady, famous, iconic Matthew Brady photograph.
Yeah. Well, he had some question about that, because his hair was parted on the wrong side for that day. His barber and he always thought I think he thought that they looked a little bit peculiar, although, of course, those sittings have inspired the $5 bill photographs, the Lincoln penny.
Everything. Another question about John Brown and the Pike. Why were they numbered?
I think it was just a habit of the metal worker and the forge where they were made. Or, and we don't know, maybe the person who made them and supplied them to John Brown, and he was paid, of course, maybe he thought that these were going to go down in history as important a relic for freedom as the muskets that we used at Lexington and Concord.
It could very well be. And we're, again, to have our number 101, we're excited about that. Another question here. Did Lincoln express any opinion with respect to Brown and his actions, either publicly or privately? You have to read the book.
We've done, I think I've related all of his accounts, and that is that he thought he regarded as a traitor. That's what he said publicly. It was just dangerous for a mainstream politician, even a liberal politician of 1860, to identify with armed revolt and armed insurrection against the South. If Lincoln had had the hindsight that we have in 2020, he would look back, no doubt, on John Brown as a hero of the Second American Revolution, but he could not afford that kind of casual dismissal of the violence at that time.
Right, absolutely. Last question. Large hands can be a manifestation of Marfan's disease. Did Lincoln have this malady, and did it have any influence on his presidency?
Wow, that's a tough one to answer really quickly, but I see we're almost out of time, so I'll try. So Marfan Syndrome is a disorder, a genetic disorder that has been attributed to Lincoln. It manifests by causing its victims to be tall and loose jointed, to have eye issues, and Lincoln did have a roving eye, to suffer from depression, which arguably Lincoln did at times. However,
And his voice too, right? I mean, the voice is a little
clenched voice at times. Mm-hmm. But Marfan's patients seldom live to the age that Lincoln lived, and cut down at the age of 56. And they're also weak. They don't have power in their hands. Lincoln was a rail splitter, of course, in his youth. And in the weeks before he died, he was on a boat back from the front in Virginia, back toward the White House, and was riding on the deck of the ship and saw one of those axes in the corner of the ship. Those who are old enough will remember there used to be these axes in our public schools that said, in case of fire, break glass with this axe and get a hose and put out the fire, I guess. But it was an axe, and Lincoln said to his young guests on board, I'd like to show you a feat of strength. I wonder if any of you could do this. And this is something that we have witnesses attesting that he did it periodically. If he saw an axe in an office building or a government building, he liked to show off. And I'm going to do a poor imitation of an axe. I have a pen. He took it between his thumb and his forefinger and extended it as far and held it parallel. And then for effect, let it drop thud to the deck of the ship. And he said, anyone like to try? Guess what? No one could do it. And so he enjoyed showing that off. And every physician I've ever spoken to insists that a Marfan could not accomplish that at age 56. So I don't think he had Marfan syndrome, but it is a tough myth to destroy.
Well, that's a lot of information that packed into 2 minutes and 45 minutes too. And I see that we're out of time. And thank you so much, Harold, for being such a terrific partner in tonight's program and in this series, which I really look forward to doing with you.
I do too. It's a great first episode. And Val, thank you for being such a great partner in the Civil War in 50 Objects, and to Louise for making it all possible.
Yeah, it was a real thrill, and I'm so happy to revisit it. And I want to thank our audience too for watching this evening, and for your attention, for your questions, and most importantly, for your membership support through this time. We look forward to seeing you back here a week from tonight, when we'll move from our pre-war stirrings to the war itself, looking at a trio of objects connected to abolition. So until then, thank you, and good night all.
Good night.